I want to say how excited we are to try this out and happy to have you here. And thank you again for your support. We are very happy today to do this first session live with Dorothy Heyl. And what this actually, how this evolved was that we had started this season as we were preparing for opening and bringing on all of our seasonal staff to have our to have regular trainings each month, where sort of deep dives subject specialist talks, which is what today's talk is in that series. And this was for all of our volunteers and staff, many of whom, most of whom I think are attending today. And we were doing it in the Wagon House at Olana, and giving an opportunity for some of the scholars and specialists and curators who we work closely with through the years to come and sort of deepen our staff knowledge about subjects related to Olana, to church, to American art, to environmental history. So we had already set up with Dorothy to do this in person, and she was very gracious to sort of accelerate her timetable here and be our first speaker. Dorothy has been an incredible supporter and volunteer and member of the Olana Partnership for many years. She is a lawyer practicing for 35 years now. But she also is an incredible researcher and historian in her own right. Got her master's in English from UVA, is a very active citizen of the city of Hudson, which of course is our home base for Olana. And Dorothy has been involved in particular with working on researching the preservation history of Olana, the origins of the Olana Partnership as a nonprofit, which date back to 1964, and the organization Olana Preservation, Inc., which I imagine will come up today in Dorothy's conversation. And so Dorothy was a member of our 50th anniversary committee back in 2015, 2016, participated in many of those events. She also was one of the experts who was interviewed by HMT for the documentary we did on the 50th anniversary called Saving Elana, an American Treasure. And so we're very, very pleased to have Dorothy here today to offer her perspective and deep dive research on the subject of David Huntington and the saving of Elana. Dorothy.
Thank you, Sean. I want to say that the first time I ever met Sean Sawyer was, I gave a little speech on the saving of Elana, I don't know, maybe right at the time that Sean came to the partnership. And it was down at Basilica, and it was very last minute. There wasn't much publicity. So you can imagine how thrilled I was when the new president of the Elana Partnership walked in and listened to the speech and heard some things he hadn't heard before, and it became a deep interest of his as well. I also want to thank Mark Przorski, who invited me to do this. He is one of my best friends, and he is my muse in all things Olana. And Margot, you've been amazing. Thank you very much. So the particular topic that I chose to talk about is David Huntington. Now I am researching for a book that I will write someday, and I'm writing it, but it's taking a very long time. Anyway, David Huntington is a central figure in the book, and I have learned a great deal about him. And I decided that in order to have material that was deep and interesting, but only 40 minutes worth, I would just concentrate on one figure in the epic saving of Elana. So the figure I chose is David Huntington. Now, we all know the name David Huntington from as one of the visionaries who saved Olana back in the 1960s. But in truth, what do we really know about him? Aside from, there's a kind of blurry photo of him in Jim Ryan's book. He gave an interview in 1988, which you'll be hearing a lot more about. But what do we really know about David Huntington? We know he has a very nice last name. So, is he related to the Huntington Library in California? I get that question all the time. People just assume it because he was involved in preservation, and that's a very expensive undertaking. David Huntington was descended from an American patriarch, Simon Huntington, whose wife crossed the ocean from England in 1633 with 4 sons. Simon died en route. I said California. I should say California. He counted among his forebears Samuel Huntington, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, president of the Continental Congress, and governor of California. He was only distantly related, however, to the railroad magnate Henry Edwards Huntington of San Marino, California, who descended from another one of the 4 Huntington brothers back in the 17th century. So, no, he was not related to the Huntington Library in California. The men on David Huntington's side of the family tended to be teachers or ministers. And Huntington's father was a minister, at least initially. Now, here's another question for you. Perhaps you're asking, was David Huntington the son of the famous nudist Henry Strong Huntington? Yes, he was. Henry Strong Huntington graduated from Yale in 1904, became a Presbyterian minister in 1912, married a woman whose father had founded a meat packing company that produced Red Heart dog food. And then David Huntington's father discovered the German nudist movement. And he spent much of his wife's fortune establishing a nudist movement in America, convinced that nudism affirmed the goodness of man. Okay, so now we know one thing about David Huntington. But who was he? These are the facts. He was born in 1922. He studied art history at Princeton and then at Yale. He taught art history at Smith College for 11 years. He became a professor of art history at the University of Michigan and then died of a heart attack in September 29, 1990. And that's all you need to know about him, at least according to his obituary in the New York Times. Maybe you can see that little obituary at the bottom there on the right next to the obituary of the 22-year-old stock car driver. Huntington's death was a terrible shock. It was not only the New York Times that was unprepared. He was only 67, and he was at the height of his profession. A list of his accomplishments in the year before his death is breathtaking. He prepared this for his department at the University of Michigan. If you can see the screen, you can see that you can see the 4th item. He was working with Gerald Carr on the catalog Raisonné. He wrote this paper right below that, which I'll be talking about later. But the key thing on this list is at the top of the 2nd page. Intermittently throughout the year, I have been pursuing research on Thomas Cole and research on church at Olana and at the Cooper Hewitt Museum. So had David Huntington's life not been cut short, the eventual obituary in the Times would no doubt at least have mentioned Olana. And we would not have had to wait until a couple of years ago for a hardcover book on Olana. I hope you all noticed when Sean was giving me that nice introduction that the hardcover book on Olana was behind him, and it's a wonderful achievement of the Olana Partnership. But this list of accomplishments is not part of the public record, and so the public still needs to know more about Olana. About who is David Huntington and why do we care about him. To understand who he was and why we're talking about him, let's look at Church's painting, The Icebergs. Now, even if you haven't seen it in Dallas, perhaps you're familiar with the sketches of the icebergs, the oil sketches at Olana. Huntington was so taken by this church, Summa, Summa, he called the great paintings, that he chose it for his 1966 book on Frederick Church. Now, this is an interesting choice, considering that the painting itself had disappeared in the 19th century, and Huntington could see it only in prints or the chromolithograph he chose for the cover of his book. So the painting had disappeared 100 years earlier after it was shown in London. It was one of 8 church paintings to be exhibited in Great Britain. A member of Parliament named Sir Edward Watkin, who had himself experienced Arctic ice and was intrigued by the possibility of a Northwest Passage, he bought the painting, and then it vanished, or it seemed to. So why was this painting chosen for the cover of Huntington's books and not one of the other Summas? The Heart of the Andes, after all, was part of the permanent exhibit at the Met, and there were surely good prints of it available. So I'd like to read from the interview of Huntington that I talked about. While he was working on a dissertation on Frederick Church, he had an epiphany about the significance of Church's landscapes. Here's how he described it. In my basement study, I had photographs of Church's paintings on the walls around me. Almost all the photographs I had of Church's paintings were ones I had had to take because the paintings just hadn't been photographed in most places. And I'd been looking at the plates in a book that had been in Church's library, which is called The World Before the Deluge. It was a translation into English from a French text by Louis Figet. I looked at my photo of Church's Jamaica and I shouted, "Eureka!" I ran up the stairs and announced to my wife and my daughter, who was almost 4, that the end of the dissertation was in sight because I recognized that Church's landscapes were Adamic icons, as I called them then. They were a means of psychic self-realization for the American as a new man or new person in a new world. Everything just flip-flopped into place. The major paintings, I saw them all fitting into this pattern. And then I wrote the dissertation quickly in 2 summers, and I just became an amanuensis with an insight. But he didn't use this painting of Jamaica for his cover. So maybe he was making a point by choosing a painting for the cover that had literally disappeared. And his point is, perhaps, at the time he wrote this book in 1966, Church himself had almost disappeared. He begins his introduction of the book with the explanation, here's the book, the explanation, this book is a study of one of the most extraordinary and most neglected episodes in the history of American painting. Few people today know the story of the role of the painted picture in national life during the years of Manifest Destiny, yet it is one of the most interesting chapters of our artistic past. So Huntington wrote the first monograph on Church, and he chose a painting so neglected that it had actually disappeared. More than a decade after he wrote the book, and this painting appeared on the cover, it was in fact discovered in a back stairway of a boys' reformatory school in Manchester, England, in a once splendid Victorian mansion owned by the Member of Parliament who bought it from Church. You'd think that if the buyer had it in his house that you'd be able to find it, but there's a kind of twisted story about that. So in the 1970s, the city of Manchester sent a photograph of the painting and a letter of inquiry to Sotheby's in London. Specialists in American art from Sotheby's Park Bernay in New York were alerted, and the lost treasure was put up for auction. The auction made front page news, even though the importance of Church had to be explained in a sidebar. Sotheby's chief auctioneer, John L. Marion, auctioned lot 34 on October 25, 1979, in front of a hushed, standing room only crowd of 800 people. He opened the bidding at $500,000. Huntington was there in a tuxedo. After 3 minutes and 45 seconds of bidding from the room, and finally by phone, the gavel went down to an anonymous phone bidder at $2.5 million. It was the highest figure ever registered at an American auction, higher than the $2.3 million paid in 1961 for a Rembrandt that hangs at the Metropolitan. The price was almost triple the amount ever paid at auction for a painting by an American artist. By the way, the person who bought the painting was one of the Hunt brothers, and he donated it to the museum in Dallas where it now hangs. After the stunning final bid, Huntington rode the elevator with other prominent historians of American art who delighted at Huntington's pleasure at the remarkable sale price. One of them was Theodore Stebbins. He was then the curator of American paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Ted Stebbins turned to Huntington and said, "You should be proud. You created him." So, how does an art historian create a market for a long dead artist? Before we leave Huntington's book on church, let's take a look at the introduction and return to the subject of this lecture, The Saving of Elana. The book was a crucial part of Huntington's efforts to save Elana, with which he was madly in love. In the book's introduction, this is a little section from the introduction of the book. He describes Elana as a Yankee gentleman's Noah's Ark, as a hill that rises above the American Rhine, the Hudson River. In it, church lived in an eternal Genesis, surrounded with specimens from around the world. Olana, he says, was a researcher's paradise, crammed full of sketches, letters, memorabilia, including canceled checks to Brooks Brothers. But to finish the quote, at Olana, one is suddenly surprised to discover himself living in Church's paintings. Olana is a never-ending church. I like the word Gesamtkunstwerk to describe Olana. I learned it in this book that came out a few years called In the Temple of the Self. It's about the Gesamtkunstwerk of various artists around the world, and it has a lovely chapter on Olana. So it's a total work of art is what Olana is, and that was the reason that Huntington was so energized to help save it. So the question is, how did he come to discover this Victorian artist Gesamtkunstwerk? Now, I hope all of you have read his the compelling story of his discovery in the interview he gave 2 years before he died. Here's the raw data of the interview. It was by a leading historian of the preservation movement in America, Charles Hosmer. And if you can see from what's on the screen, Hosmer interviewed Huntington March 27, 1988. Now the interview was taped and transcribed, and about 10 years ago, I edited it and published a pamphlet that's still available in the Elana gift shop. It was this project that inspired my long-term project of a book about the saving of Elana. So today I'm going to refer to the interview, but I'm not going to summarize it. If there's any takeaway from this lecture, it should be read the interview if you haven't done it already. But briefly, just to tell you the bare outlines, while Huntington was working on his dissertation on Church at Yale, he heard that Church's upstate New York residence was still extant, and that Church's daughter-in-law, Sally Goodchurch, lived in it. He wrote a letter to Sally Church asking about a visit, and was referred by one of her companions to Church's nephew, Charles T. Lark Jr., a lawyer in New York. Lark, who had the power of attorney over Sally Church's estate, gave him permission to visit Elana in December 1953. Concerned about the effects of the visit on his aunt, Lark wrote a letter to Sally's doctor, and he received this reply from Carl Whitbeck, MD, in February 1954. So you see it says, keep that research fellow completely out of her way. It might be disturbing. And you can read the humorous details of how he kept out of Sally Church's way in the interview. More to the point, as Huntington tells his first visit to Elana in the interview, to return to the source. I went into the house absolutely bewildered by what I saw, not at all expecting such a relic of the 19th century. It was virtually untouched, unchanged since the 19th century. When I went up into the attic after lunch, I was staggered. Just the abundance of material that was there. Hundreds of drawings by Church, scores and scores of oil studies by the painter, and canceled checks, journals, prints that the artist had had, photographs, hundreds and hundreds of photographs, and some paintings by other artists, and so on. So he got permission from Lark, and he spent a number of weeks in 1954 poring over the treasures that he had found. In 1955, Huntington began teaching at Smith College, where one of his mentors, Oliver Larkin, was the head of the art history department. You know, I want to say that one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book about Elana is that the interview is amazing, but it contains all these references that are kind of lost on us, you know, 50 years later. And so I have taken the time to figure out who the various players are in the Huntington story. Oliver Larkin had written a book in 1949 that was a comprehensive survey called Art and Life in America. This book won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1950, which was a first for art history. Now, one thing that might surprise you about this book is that he included a picture of the Elana Villa in the book. And he also described its architecture at some length. And the reason I'm focusing on this is that it was 1949, okay? It wasn't as if Elana had disappeared from the world. Art historians still knew about Elana and considered it to be a major piece of Victorian architecture. So Larkin wrote, the exterior of Elana bristled with turrets which suggested minarets, and a large square tower provided a magnificent survey of the Hudson and Catskills beyond it, etc. An elaborate window on the stair landing bathed the cross-shaped hallway in amber light, etc. The painted friezes proved the artist's oriental obsession and his perseverance as a collector in Palestine and Syria. While at Smith, Huntington was traveling around the country to find Frederick Church paintings in museums and private collections. But he wouldn't have had to go far for this one, Morning in the Tropics, which is in the Smith College Art Museum and still on exhibit. It may have been around this time that Huntington became focused on Church and Elana to a point that some might consider unhealthy. He went to Elana day after day, taking copious notes and photographs of the drawings of the house, the individual objects in the house, particularly things by Church. He went back to New Haven, quote, occasionally to visit my wife, and also to be on hand when our first child was born. To Trudy Huntington, his attention to Elana was understandably galling. She says he was present for the birth of their first daughter, Abigail, only because he had a seminar at Yale to attend. Though second fiddle to Elana, Trudy became a partner in her husband's heroic efforts in the 1960s. I've had the great pleasure of getting to know Trudy. She's a remarkable person, and a scholar in her own right. In the 1960s, at the time David was learning about church in Olana, Trudy was studying the Amish, and she was trying to answer the question, what are the attitudes that make people either want to preserve the earth or destroy it? This was her lifelong quest of understanding. Fun fact, Huntington's unusual facial hair is explained by his visits with Trudy at the time to a Hutterite community that she was studying. When she was 2 years old, Abigail Huntington, David and Trudy's daughter, visited Olana with her mother. Sally Church had them to tea in the dining room. She was an exemplary hostess, using her best china and silver for a generous spread of treats. Abby was very well behaved, while Trudy and Sally engaged in polite conversation. The plan was to make a good impression on Sally Church, and it succeeded. So we'll leave it there. Huntington left Olana soon, probably after that tea, and he was not worried about future access to the villa. Lark promised to call and let him know as soon as Sally Church died. She was 86 at the time, and she would live another 10 years. As I think probably all of you know, if you know anything about Olana and Sally Church, her amazing longevity is part of one of the really significant facts about why Olana was saved. Huntington was waiting patiently over the years for a call from Charles Lark. But then in 1964, a film librarian at Time Life named James Rico learned that Frederick Church's estate, Olana, was about to be broken up and sold. Now, Rico was a scene maker from New Orleans who lived in a dilapidated neoclassical mansion in Piermont, New York, and he collected 19th century marble sculptures. I want to pause here to talk about one of the very cool and strange things about my study of Olana, and that is the number of coincidences. I mean, you know, I live in Scarsdale. You know, my father went to Princeton. There's all sorts of, my initials are DH. There's all sorts of coincidences, but the Rico coincidence is the most striking, and that is that dilapidated neoclassical mansion in Piermont, New York. Well, I saw the picture of it on the internet, and guess what? It's where I went to nursery school in 1955. So I guess Rico must have bought it after Miss Lombardi sold it. Anyway, Rico called his friend Stuart Feld, who was then at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and told him that the last living relative of Frederick Church had died. Would Feld like to go up to Hudson with him and see it? Now, I would like to thank Kay Toll, who I saw in the list of registrants. She introduced me to Feld, and I took this picture of him when Kay kindly took me to his art studio. I mean, his gallery. Anyway, Feld was cataloging the Met's collection of American paintings, and he naturally knew of David Huntington, the main, if not the only scholar working on for Frederick Church. Feld mentioned the news of Sally Church's death to Huntington. Huntington's response was total shock. In disbelief, he told Feld, well, this is not true. He had relied on Lark's promise to let him know right away. He'd patiently been waiting over the years. Huntington told Feld, I would have been called first. And then Huntington called up the registrar in Hudson to see if it was true. And it was only after the newspaper confirmed it that Huntington gave any credence to what Feld had told him. And this moment is when the battle to save Olana commenced. Huntington called Charles Lark and made 2 points. One was I wanted to get to Olana to document the place. The other was I would hope that I could have time to organize an effort to preserve Olana. Huntington also called E.P. Richardson, known as Ted, the director of Winterthur. Richardson sent a telegram to Russell Lynes, an editor at Harper's, whose 1954 book, The Tastemakers, had mentioned Olana. This telegram was sent. And afterwards, a small group, including Edgar Kaufman, the owner of the Falling Water, who he inherited Falling Waters, and he donated to the public. They went to Olana, and Russell Lynes described the outing in his column in Harper's, which you can see an off print of it on the right. Now I see that time is passing, so I'm not going to read you this article, but if you can't find it in the Olana archives, I thoroughly recommend it. At the time, the paintings were in the process of being transferred to Park Bernay Galleries in New York City, and they were being stored at a storage facility on 2nd Avenue and 61st Street in Manhattan. Huntington heard that an auctioneer named Gilbert Rundle was going to have an estate sale of all the objects in the house that weren't paintings. He did an appraisal of the Olana house contents, and some of the examples might surprise us today. The dining room table with 5 leaves, which could seat 4 to 20, depending. This table we're also familiar with was valued at $100 in the appraisal. Now, if that seems low, well, multiply it by 8, it might seem a little more reasonable, 800, but even that would have been low for such a table. For some unusual pieces, the prices were a little bit higher. These chairs may be $150 or $200. But what the appraisal misses, and what we all know about, which is so important, is the artistic significance of these chairs. I mean, the one on the right, the Charter Oak chair, is my favorite object, one of them at Olana, because it's made from the pieces of the Charter Oak, which was an important figure in the history of Church and Thomas Cole. And as we know, a picture of the Charter Oak hangs at Olana. So, you know, to say this chair has a value of $100 is ludicrous in our view. The entire contents of the house, less the paintings and books, was appraised by Rundle Gilbert to have a value of $104,000. So when Huntington heard about this auction about to happen, he was spurred into action, not only by that, but also by a former advertising executive named Don Kirshen. And Don Kirshen got Huntington to write telegrams to all the museum directors all over the country to tell them that Olana was in danger of liquidation. As Huntington said, he was holed up in a hotel room in Hudson at the St. Charles, just made phone call after phone call after phone call. He had such a high phone bill, his wife Trudy told me, that the IRS started investigating. They thought he was running a gambling ring. It was that extraordinary. He then went armed with the telegrams to a meeting with the executives for the Sally Church estate. Heading the meeting was Fred Osborne, who joined the Olana vanguard at the prompting of his friend, Mariah Livingston. She's a church descendant who still lives in the Olana viewshed, and she was working behind the scenes to preserve the estate. Fred Osborne was 6'10", and with his booming voice, he was able to persuade the executors to let them have some time, which they got. Osborne, by the way, you may know, is his grandfather was a close friend. His grandfather, William Henry Osborne, was a railroad tycoon and very close friend of Frederick Church. So Lark and Sigler, the executor at Bankers Trust, agreed, saying, okay, we'll change our hands. We'll give you 3 months to get yourself organized, and then we'll confer again to decide what to do. And you can see from this article, this is one of many in the New York Times. They got amazing coverage in the New York Times, in part, I think, perhaps because there was a fledgling architecture person there, Ada Louise Huxtable, and she perhaps was supporting the breathless coverage in the Times of this battle. They had a 3-month reprieve, but with Thanksgiving, Christmas in the way, they didn't make much progress in 1964. Well, it wasn't until 1965 a formal effort began. An extension, the first of several, was granted, and Olana Preservation, Inc. was formed in February. The group negotiated an option with the Sally Church estate to buy Olana at the conclusion of fundraising. They paid about $20,000 for the option. They would need another $30,000 upon expiration, and then they would have to pay $420,000 to take title to the property. And meanwhile, they had to keep paying monthly rent on the property and pay other expenses such as insurance. Now, if $420,000 sounds inexpensive to you, there's 2 reasons for that. First, you have to multiply it by 8, so you can see that it wasn't really $500,000. And second, believe it or not, during the very successful effort of Olana Preservation, Inc. to publicize the plight of Olana, the value actually rose very significantly. And so by the time they did exercise the option, the estate was not so thrilled with the price that they had originally negotiated. So Fred Osborne and Nelson Rockefeller's cousin, Sam Aldrich, led the fundraising drive. Huntington's role was to tell this story, to explain why a forgotten 19th century artist's home was worth saving. So for the next year and a half, he championed church and the world he'd created to local groups at the library and millionaires living on Park Avenue. Meanwhile, he was still teaching at Smith, constantly driving the 160 miles between Northampton and Hudson. And if you want to, the interview has amusing stories about how Smith College was not exactly thrilled with their the absenteeism of their American history professor. A crucial part of Huntington's successful effort was his book on the paintings. It was one thing to be acknowledged as a recognized expert on an obscure landscape painter, but it was an accomplishment of a different magnitude to have published the first ever monograph on Church. Braziller, the publisher in New York, approached him about it, and he was impelled by the preservation need to get it done. And one example of the support that friends groups like the Olana Partnership and Olana Preservation, Inc. is that they bought many copies of the book in advance, so Braziller could go ahead with it, not worrying about profit. So the book helped restore Frederick Church's preservation, but Olana's preservation. In the end, not enough money was raised to set up a foundation, and if they had, they could have donated to the National Trust, but they didn't raise nearly enough funds to support it. So the last few months before the option expired finally was a frantic effort to bridge the gap in the funds raised, and they managed to interest New York State in acquiring it. So a crucial step, but not really the last step in the campaign, was getting the legislation signed that would enable the state to acquire it. On June 7th, 1966, Governor Nelson Rockefeller flew to Olana in a helicopter and signed the bill on the steps of the villa. It was a triumphant moment for Huntington. This is a picture from the bell tower, and you can see the governor with his jacket off in Huntington. It was also a sweet moment for his wife Trudy. They would leave. they would soon leave Smith College. They left Smith in 1966 and went to the University of Michigan. Huntington said about this, "I moved here to Ann Arbor in the summer of '66. People have tried to get me involved in preservation work, but I've stayed at arm's length. I mean, it was terribly hard on the family, the campaign, very hard with 3 young kids. My wife had to just take on a lot that I wasn't doing. There was a real deficiency. It was not good. But I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't acted as I did. I would have been worse in the long run because I would have just had a bad conscience, I think, and had a sense of failure, which I would have had to live with." So we're getting toward the end of our time. I just want to refer to something that was on that 1989 list of accomplishments. Huntington wrote a piece called "The Center of the World." And if any of you have ever seen me give tours of Olana, you know that I love to point out the point that Huntington makes in this piece about how when you're in the court hall and you look toward the yellow light of the east, and then you look the other direction toward the river, and Huntington points out you actually can tell that there used to be a cross there in the plate glass window. There are mullions there that show there used to be crossing, so that you would look toward the east, and then you turn around and you look toward the south and you see America. One more quote from Huntington. He said, "Olana was a totality. I mean, the whole thing was a state of American mind, and it was in 3 dimensions, palpable. It was a concretation of the American spirit of a certain moment. And I mean, it wasn't just Frederick Church. It was us. It was we. It was as much America as, say, Versailles is France, which is not only Louis XIV, it's also Frenchness of a certain moment, or as much as, say, Monticello is. I saw it in that light, that it was a crystallization of what we've been and just there, potentially to remain there, indefinitely for posterity." So we all know that Saving Elana is a continuous process that didn't happen in a flash when a governor flew into Hudson on a helicopter. It was years of work, both in the 1960s and through to the present, when Church's design landscape is still being reclaimed and threats to the viewshed persist. Perhaps you've heard that the viewshed was threatened in the 1970s when there was a plan to construct a nuclear power plant squarely in the iconic view of the bend of the river south of Olana. And David Huntington was one of the most influential voices supporting the successful effort to oppose the siting. He was able to convey to Carl Petrick, the brave man at the NRC who wrote an environmental impact statement opposing the siting in Cementon, that Olana is more than just a place. Olana is a totality. This is a picture I took just the other day. And Olana has been a wonderful place for those of us who live in Hudson and are able to escape there from these strange times. Thank you. Questions?
Oh, thank you, Dorothy, very, very much. I think that one of the reactions things that you can do is a clap, but I can't find mine at the moment. So here's the real clap. I certainly have to say that I learned a few things that even in my, kind of great, obviously passion and interest in the subject did not know. Certainly the nudist father, that is new to me.
Like I said, that's one of the things. I mean, the interview has it all from David Huntington's perspective, But David wasn't going to talk about his nudist father, right? I mean, I got that from Trudy.
Well, maybe there was no need to, but it certainly is. It certainly is a fascinating. I mean, anyway? Well, let's just let me put out a pitch, please. If you have questions for Dorothy, you can tell she can dive very deeply. So please ask away. I have a few. You can type your questions into the Q&A, and I can bring them up. So I encourage you to do that. So let me just start off, Dorothy, with a couple of questions. I understood that so you said he started his research at Olana in, what year was it, 1954?
54.
Okay, right. And when did he actually finish the degree, get his PhD?
He was working on it. He was working on it throughout the time he was at Smith. I mean, he took a couple summers off at Smith, like 56 and 57, I think, and then he went back. But the part that I read from the book said that he wrote it in a couple summers. So I think it probably would have been around 57. And frankly, I think it's really a shame that the dissertation is not available to be read. It actually is a biography of Church. And, it would be great if somebody would.
So it's see, that's interesting, because that was my next thing. The first book, the one with the icebergs on the cover, that, and I remember reading the oral history, that you edited, and doesn't he say in there that the preservation battle motivated him to turn the dissertation into a book? But most dissertations have several books in them, right? So is there a lot, have you been able to read the dissertation or see it?
I've seen the dissertation at Trudy's place,
Okay.
but I don't have a copy of it.
So it's not on the UMI system, that now all dissertations are put up.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely something to do. But what he did say, I think in the interview, was that he had the insight about the American Renaissance, the relevance of Melville, and Whitman and people like that to Church, which is, I'm a literature, I did a MA in literature. So to me, that part is really interesting, and I have taken very little art history courses. But it was a insight later that led to the book, which was Church's relationship to 18th century, 17th century landscape painters. And what he said was he realized that Church had a heroic landscape where he didn't need to have people in his landscapes because the natural formations and the trees were themselves heroic figures. And that's one of the reasons I just love the Charter Oak and the Charter Oak chair, because the Charter Oak is a personage, it right. is part of the heroic Absolutely. Landscape. So Huntington did distinguish between the approaches in the book and the approach in the dissertation.
Great, good. Curious, because I didn't know this before, that the first call, I think you said it was the first call, or the first contact after learning about Sally's death and the imminent dispersal, was to the director at Winter. Do you know what that connection was, or why? Was he thinking that as a decorative arts and site that with deep pockets with the DuPonts, that they would somehow help out? Or?
Oh yeah, there was. You can see that in the interview. He was definitely interested in having the DuPonts help out. I think they might have given something, but they didn't give the help that he would have hoped for. And James Hamilton, who was the lawyer at Milbank, who worked on the bill to save Elana, has explained to me that patricians of that type really have local interests, that the DuPonts probably felt that Elana was something for the Rockefellers, et cetera. It really wasn't something for, Delaware.
Right, in the Rockefeller territory. Well, I have to say, we have benefited greatly from the family over time, and still today, Rockefeller support helps with our landscape work and everything. So that's
yeah, there could be another presentation like this on the Rockefellers.
Right.
That was something that I barely mentioned.
Yeah. So we've got a few questions now. Let's see. And I just want to pull my screen out so I can read them here. So George Baker writes, to thank you, first of all, for your commitment and passion, and wonders, are all of the artifacts as part of the collection still intact? Have any been auctioned off to continue raising money? Certainly, I could say no.
That's John's question.
Yeah, that is more mine. So I will say, yes, Olana is remarkably intact. And if anything, we have been able to reacquire a few things that left the property during Sally and her husband Louis Church's time. And so that is the only thing that we acquire, are things that were originally at Olana. We get approached a lot by people who say, I have a wonderful church sketch. Would you be interested? But if it wasn't recorded as something that was at Olana, or a painting, then we are just not. We're focused on Olana.
And
so
that's
yes.
really one of the great things about Olana. I mean, you just compare it to, say, the Coal House across the river, which had one of those sales, and people, even Stephen Stewart Feld, I think, were able to buy really good things at the Coal House sale. Mm-hmm. Olana, it was never, because David Huntington and people he persuaded were so convinced that this was a world at Olana. This was something to be preserved. There was never a thought of selling anything at all. In fact, one of the little details I love is that, Sally Church preserved it so beautifully that when they looked, they saw that that apparently Church, with his arthritic hands, tried to paint with his left hand when he was older, and that the paintbrushes were left in a way you could see that somebody tried to paint with their left hand. Huh. So there is this sense of it being like I said, a Gesamtkunstwerk. It's a total work of art, and you don't sell off pieces of a work of art.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we're very happy to say, yes, it's incredibly intact. It's really, as we believe, the most intact artist home and studio collection in the country, certainly, if not the world.
Oh, and if you go to Olana and don't see all that stuff, it's because a lot of it is preserved up at People's Island.
Yes, absolutely. Where it's conserved and protected by New York State and the Bureau of Historic Sites, which we are the only state to have the fortunate, establishment of that, again, under Nelson Rockefeller. So there is a talk there about Rockefeller and his time. Martha Moran, one of our great volunteers. Hi, Martha. Thank you for being on today. Has a question. She said, "Did Huntington have any part in cataloging the contents of Olana? Perhaps going deeper after the property sale was resolved."
Okay, so I think the answer to that is, first he talks about all the cataloging he did back in the 50s. And he certainly tried to do cataloging in the 60s. But the main cataloger is Gerald Carr, right? And Gerald Carr is a student of David Huntington's and totally devoted to David. I met him at Trudy's house when I went down there to visit. So yes, I'm sure David had some role in what Gerald Carr was doing.
Yes, and Professor Carr comes, regularly to Olana every year, and is the authenticator, as they say in the art world, for Frederick Church. He's the person that you need to have a stamp of research approval on to authenticate your work as being by Church. So that's a Huntington legacy piece, definitely, is his teaching this body of students. And I have to say, he apparently Huntington. Was an incredibly effective teacher in the classroom, besides being this incredible, right? Because Bindi K, one of our trustees, had him at Smith and said that, Olana was brought forward very strongly to the class. And it's one of the things that, had gotten her engaged with us initially. So. Have you come across other students who's had anything to say about it?
Yeah, I've interviewed a few of them. One of them, I didn't bring it up with me from Scarsdale, but there's something that the Crayon published 20 or 30 years ago called a Flora Legum that's in honor of David Huntington. And it has various essays about him. And you can see there's a student there that writes about him.
Okay. We have another question, from Anya Andreeva, which is, would this research be incorporated into the visitor experience at Olana? And certainly, some of it is. Some of it, though, is also, certainly available for those with a deeper interest. We're always trying to continue research and bring things forward into our interpretive experience. So Dorothy has volunteered and has given many tours at Olana. So certainly, maybe in the future, Dorothy, there's another special David Huntington focused tour in your future.
That's a good point. I mean, I think you see this picture that I showed. It was just it was just so I could show you my dog. So I was giving tours at Olana and quite enjoying hearing what people were asking and sharing my knowledge, because it's really the thing that motivates me, is to be able to share stuff with people. But I got this dog, and then he was just a puppy, and I had to take care of him. So my touring was interrupted.
Good. Sorry, I'm just reading some other questions. One is from David Lynch, another one of our amazing interpreters currently, and he said, is Huntington's book out of print?
Oh, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is, but with out of print books, you go onto the internet, you find them, and you pay sometimes a remarkably low price for them.
It's true. When I first came and I was, getting the bibliography together for my own Olana library, I was able to find a copy either on Amazon, which has a lot of, resellers and people who are connected through Amazon Books, or ABE Books is another one that you can look at, or eBay even, you can find books.
This book should go back into print, however.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say one comment that, as you read what Huntington wrote, and I think we'd love to put out a couple of these articles to everybody who participated today, the Harper's article by Russell Lines, and maybe the Center of the World piece. Oh,
yeah, I've always thought that off-print should be available in the Olana bookstore, and people could, I think this off-print was available in the Olana bookstore.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then if people could pay 50 cents or $1 for it, they can go home with it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Or perhaps we can go more, as we're working now in this crazy period of the world that we're all in, to do things more digitally. We can get these things up on our website for members in particular who support. We greatly appreciate and depend more than ever on. So I don't want to miss saying that. So thank you, all of you who are members with us. There's a couple other questions. I know we're very close to time. We're want to keep this to an hour. So let me just, one is a fairly complex one. Elizabeth Kanega, Beth writes, love the presentation, so many insights that we wouldn't know from behind the scenes, and ask about the relationship between Huntington and Lark. Beth, you have Lark, and it's Charles Lark Jr., and how that relationship played out through the preservation effort, if there's any evidence you've come across after that initial, like where Lark did not, inform David Huntington, but, do you have other evidence about how they
all right.
did?
In the end, I think Huntington's interview is very negative on Lark. It is the case, however, that Bankers Trust negotiated something with Olana Preservation Inc. that Bankers Trust then bragged about in an ad, how they had been so foresighted to deal with the Olana Preservation Inc. I will also say that Ricky Lark is on the phone, I believe, and I haven't spoken to him yet about this project, but he has offered to let me see his archive, and I'm very much looking forward to doing that. So as far as Huntington would tell you, it was not a good relationship. But there are always two sides to every story, and that's why one of the things that motivated me to write the book. I mean, I showed the interview transcript to Sam Aldrich, and he was horrified by it, He showed me all sorts of things that he would have said differently. So there's
oral history is very subjective.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, as
so
they say,
mentioning Ricky Lark, who's one of our trustees as well, and resident of Catskill. So yes, I believe Ricky and his husband Ricky, who are also regular volunteers at Olana, are with us today on this call. And so I'm going to end with a couple comments from Dr. Christine Oaklander, who is next week's speaker. And Christine says, again, thank you, Dorothy, so much. And thank you also for introducing the relationship, the Osborne Church relationship, which is going to be the focus of Dr. Oaklander's talk next week at this time, which will also be live. And it's fascinating. I've read a few of her articles about that relationship of patronage and friendship. So I hope you all will be able to join us there. Christine also writes here a second comment. Florence Cole Vincent ran an antique shop out of Cedar Grove, the Thomas Cole site today. So even before the big auction in the early 1960s, Cole art and artifacts disappeared from the house. Yes. So it was a home run antique business, but fortunately the flow is reversed now, coming back, right? So on that positive note,
come back in though.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dorothy, again, so much. Really enjoyed this. And I have a few other questions I can do with you offline that I'm just fascinated about. And Russell Lines, I can't let this go. You were the one who discovered the letter to Russell Lines from Jackie Kennedy, as she was at the time, in 1966. In the Archives of American Art, saying when you were doing research around the 50th anniversary, writing to him and talking about her role politically in lobbying on behalf of Elana, which we had not really had an understanding of how politically involved she had been.
Right, and there's a lot of research that I have done over the years when I was a lawyer at Milbank, which was the law firm for Elana Preservation, Inc., and as I head to my retirement, who knows, I might actually be able to spend some real hours doing research and find more of those important connections.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dorothy. This was really enjoyable. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Stay well.